We're 2 minutes out. There's a 2-minute warning. We'll start the plenary session at 12:45. 2-minute warning to try to find your seats. Okay, good afternoon. We're going to start the plenary session now. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair of this plenary session, the Honorable Zach Heim, currently serving as a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and of course, a former Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller, Chief Financial Officer for the DoD. Honorable Zach Heim, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. We've got a distinguished panel here, and I don't want to blab on too long. I'll let them blab instead. And I would prefer that instead of introducing you all, even my good friend Jamie Moran, who I've known forever, I'll let each of you introduce yourselves. And I'm going to start at the very end with Vice Admiral Terry Blake. And if you don't know him, you probably ought to take his classes. So over to you, Terry.
Hey, thank you, sir. So good afternoon. I'm Vice Admiral retired Terry Blake. I teach out here at Monterey on a part-time basis. I teach I guess you'd call it a day's work in finance over in the Defense Management School. And I jokingly say after the students take it, I put half of them on a suicide watch. Because it's just, it can be rather daunting to them when they see what we go through in the PPBE process. I consider myself more of an operator. I did half my career at sea, and I did the other half of my career in the building and money. I had 8 tours or jobs in the 8 world. So I had 2 tours in J8 and then 6 tours in N8. And we jokingly used to say that all of us in the finance business had a dollar sign tattooed on our heads, or on our foreheads, I should say. So I come to this, I did not serve on the Blue Ribbon panel. So I come to this event as an outsider or somebody looking at it from an operator's perspective. I will leave that to my compatriots here, Elizabeth and Laura next, and Jamie down there at the end. But I would tell you the base, I would look at it from the perspective of if you can do anything to increase the speed at which you get things out to the folks at the pointy end of the spear, then I think you would find that everybody is for it because that's why we function. It is to get the product out to the folks at the pointy end of the spear. The second thing I tell you is if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, and I started reading it last week, unlike those here, this definitely passes the weight test. But I would tell you, I have 2 recommendations for you. My first recommendation is if you are just coming into it or you're just trying to learn it, is to get a copy, I believe they have them out here, of this document, which is basically, the front is an advertisement for it, but the back are the 28 recommendations that they put together for it. I think, and they've highlighted the ones that I think are of primary importance, and they've broken them down into 5 categories. And the second thing I would strongly suggest to you is that if you do nothing else, at the very least, read the 10-page executive summary at the beginning of the document. I think it's an excellent synopsis, and I came to it cold. So if you're coming to it cold, I strongly recommend that to you. And I think it gives you a sense of what the group was trying to accomplish. I'll leave it at that, and then I'll turn it over to, I guess, Elizabeth. I guess you're up
Well,
next.
before I ask Liz and Lara to speak, and I noticed, Larry, you were holding this up like it was The Price is Right. You'll note,
The reform is right.
that's right. You'll note that we're both senior people on the staff of the commissions, and I'm serving on a commission right now, and it's my 3rd. A commission is no better than the senior staff. I was fortunate to be on the commission that revised the retirement system. That's because we had a terrific staff. I was on another commission that dealt with contracting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Congress did nothing because we did not have a good staff. It's all about the staff. And so having said that, Elizabeth, is it Beery?
Yes.
There you go. I even knew that. So over to you, Elizabeth.
You get extra points for saying it properly, so thank you. I'm Elizabeth Beery. I was very fortunate to be the Director of Research on the commission, on our very small team, working with 14 commissioners. I come to it with a background. I've been a cost and price analyst. I have been a logistician, primarily working sustainment and acquisition policy. And then I come to it from also being a financial manager inside OSD Comptroller twice, and then also with the Marine Corps in programs and resources. So it's, I guess we like to say we have some of the practical experience about where some of the challenges were and the pain points. So I think I'm very proud of the work that we all did together and the report, and hope you all find it interesting and engaging as well.
Well, I'm Laura Sayer, the Executive Director of the Commission. I come to this work gladly after 26 years of being a DoD professional in acquisition and finance. I spent about 18 years with the Air Force in program offices, working in a lot of space systems. So if you know space almost equals Nunn-McCurdy breach, I have a couple of those under my belt. So I'm pretty hardened from that. I did a few years at Special Operations Command as the Deputy Comptroller there. A lot of great lessons learned from how SOF does business. And we got trying to carry that water in parts of our report as well. And then I did a few years with the Navy. I was the Comptroller for the Office of Naval Research, and then also the Comptroller for both CNIC and NAVFAC at the same time. Interesting experience being a comptroller for 2 commands at once. So when I had the chance to help be a part of the solution to reform PPBE, I jumped at the chance to see what I could do to help be a part, be a part of the solution and work with these great commissioners. Jamie, I've worked with before, and it's been a pleasure all this time. So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Laura. For those of you I don't know, I'm Jamie Morin. Right now, I work with Aerospace Corporation, one of the FFRDCs focused on space. They were gracious enough to let me expand my work day by a few extra hours each day to serve on the commission for the last 2 years. I wanted to say, just as we're beginning here, that it was a real pleasure to work with the absolutely top-notch staff that Laura hired, to work with Laura personally, and especially to work with Bob Hale and Ellen Lord, our chair and vice chair. Bob, of course, knows essentially everything there is to know about resource management, and Ellen balanced that out with a corporate perspective and an acquisition leadership perspective that I think helped us really focus the commission on the issues that inspired the legislation creating it, which gets to exactly what Terry said. It's how can we rapidly get war-winning capabilities to the tip of the spear? We were created due to a sense of urgency. And process exists for important reasons to balance critical equities. Urgency sometimes requires rethinking process, and that was really a focus for our commission's work. And it required us to relook a lot of things that are comfortable for people in particularly the resource management business, but also the acquisition business. We know the rule set. We may not like it, but we know it. And so we've challenged some of those assumptions. If these recommendations are implemented, it will be a change in how the department conducts its business. And that is a great deal of cheese moving, but hopefully it's moving to a place that allows us to get those capabilities to the tip of the spear a little bit faster.
Well, for those of you who don't know who Bob Hale is, apart from being one of my oldest friends, he was probably the most capable comptroller, certainly in my professional lifetime. And having been a comptroller myself, I think I know what a really good one is like, and Bob Hale was the best. And I know he was supposed to be here, personal reasons he can't be, and he's missed. Having said that, I want to pick up on something Jamie said, just to give you some feel for what the urgency was. When I became comptroller in 2001, so I'm an ancient mariner now, I knew Bob McNamara. And McNamara says to me, "Are they still using that PPBE system that I created?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But that was like 25 years ago." So here we are 20 years after that, and we're still using PPBE. Now, when I was comptroller, I added the E, which is for execution. But apart from adding a letter to the system, nothing much changed. So what these folks have done is really crucial. We're talking about staying ahead of the Chinese. Well, you're not going to stay ahead of anybody if you're still using a 1960s system. Simple as that. So I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with Jamie, of the recommendations, which are the most urgent for you and the most important for you? And I hope each of the panelists will answer that, maybe the same way, maybe different.
Yeah, thank you, Dov. And let me start by just saying the 5 buckets that Terry mentioned are worth highlighting, and I think they fit together synergistically. So I'll cheat a little by saying you got to look at this as a whole. So the 5 buckets are: first, how do we improve the alignment of our budgets to strategy? Put another way, how do we ensure that the Secretary of Defense still maintains a reasonable amount of rudder control over a big and complex department at a time when we need more jointness to produce the military capabilities needed to deter? The second is, how do we foster innovation and adaptability? A lot of that is about getting to shorter cycle times and reducing the amount of lead that's required to turn new information into new budget decisions. The third is super critical to enabling all the others, and that's about rebooting the relationships between DoD and Congress. When Dov was coming up in the Cold War and in the immediate post-Cold War era, we had a significantly more, I'll use the word symbiotic relationship between congressional oversight and management of the department. More strategic alignment on direction, plenty of issues fought over, but a greater ability to collaborate. So we're trying to reboot and get that back. Many of the commissioners served on congressional staffs at various points in their career. One commissioner was an elected member of Congress and a senior member of the oversight committees. So that perspective was not lost on the commission, and we really are trying to drive to partnership. The fourth is modernizing the business systems and the data analytics. So how do you do better management in a department of the complexity of DoD? Part of it is you got to have data you can trust. This has been a multi-decade journey for the department. They are making progress. But you need to not only have the systems, you have to actually be able to trust them and use them. They have to be what you use for the real decision making. And then the final one is a people related issue, and is how do you grow the capabilities of the resource related workforce and ensure that they've got the skill sets they need for operating with that modern data, dealing with the pace of change that we expect in the strategic competitive environment that we're going to be operating in. So those, I think, really fit together. And in particular, doing the first two about strategic alignment and about innovation and adaptability depends deeply on that improved relationship with Congress. So now to come to the depth of your question, I think so we had 14 of what we called key recommendations. And if you have the handout here, those are the ones that are bolded. So I will reaffirm the decision of the commission to identify those 14 as particularly critical. We laid out a series of interim recommendations that were in the category of most urgent, many of which were in our interim report, and many of those are actually already in stages of implementation in DoD. We were very grateful for the support of Deputy Secretary Hicks, who reacted to the release of our interim report by directing the staff to implement a long list of the items that we came out. That's not to be taken for granted. Again, credit to the Deputy Secretary, credit also to Bob and Ellen, who worked hand in hand with department leaders to get buy-in so that we could move into execution quickly. On the transformational, let me say, I think the single biggest recommendation that would most fundamentally change how the department does business is our proposal to transform the budget structure. You get what you measure, and we lay out a transition from the current budget structure, which fundamentally is built on life cycle of an activity. So we have research and development, we have procurement, we have operations and maintenance funding, and of course personnel and military construction. But those first three are walking you through a life cycle. In many areas of military activity now, in many areas of civilian product development, those terms no longer make sense. Activities no longer progress linearly through that. They certainly don't in the software world. Increasingly in hardware dominated worlds, we're adopting more agile approaches, frequent refresh, lots of looping back. So we argue the department should shift from a structure that starts as its top level of indenture, if you will, in the table of accounts, from one that focuses on that life cycle to one that focuses on the accountable organizations, the services and major defense agencies. And then below that gets into major capability areas. And so, again, those are areas that you generally in military organizations have a senior official who is accountable for them, who's an advocate for that area. And those are the things that in many cases the Congress actually cares about. Like those are things that you can measure, and there are advocates for mobility forces. There are advocates for deep strike. We call on the department and the Congress to work together to define those major capability areas in a way that makes sense for both sides. Then below that, we get to the individual programs. Congress is still going to care about a lot of those. And then only below that do we get to how far along are you in the progress on your program. And that bottom level becomes a reporting total, but not a control total. So you get to pull out a lot of the legal rigmarole about using funds for their proper intent if the Congress adopts that structure. So those of you, most everybody in this room works in acquisition in some way, shape, or form. I think you can wrap your head around how that would transform the day-to-day management of an acquisition program. And if you're on the capability or requirement side, how that would transform how you think about a capability portfolio. The other recommendations are all very important. We're getting at fundamental structures of how the department does decision support for allocation of resources. But if you had to ask me which one would fundamentally change how the DoD did business, it would be that budget structure one.
Thanks. Lara, you might want to simply expand on that, or do you have a slightly different focus?
I'll take it a little bit differently. And if I could ask the Ian or the AV guys to pull up the slide of recommendations. I know we didn't have handouts for everybody, so you can see all 28. I think that would be
They're behind
helpful.
you now.
Yay, that's great. Okay, so I don't disagree with anything Jamie said about how transformational the new budget structure would be. It certainly would make all of our lives easier executing contracts and requirements. But I'll just say, look, these 28 recommendations, what is key, what is most important depends on where you sit in PPBE. Whether if you're at the base level or a program office, some of the recommendations related to innovation might be more helpful, or even a business system. And so I don't have to swivel chair from one system to another and enter data, and hopefully I don't make a mistake with that data entry. But to me, through all of the 2 years of research, we did a lot of engagement with Congress, a lot with DoD, and that the recommendations that get after the relationship I don't see how we'll ever get the speed, the agility we need as a department without better partnering and collaboration with Congress. We need them side by side with us. And so that means better engagement in person, better justification books and other materials, and what artifacts we give them and how quickly we give them accurate data that's not stale, as well as bringing that communication between DoD and Congress into the modern era through digital sharing of information. So right now, it's a PDF hung on a website, an Excel spreadsheet emailed, often late, instead of what the private sector does when a company communicates with its board of directors through digital methods. And they're communicating highly sensitive information that can move markets. And they figured out how to do it. And we think the DoD should develop classified and unclassified enclaves. So all of these to me work together for better sharing of information. But again, that frequency of sharing, whether it's, even if something's going well on your program, they want to hear if something's going well. If an authority that is new, how is that working for you? Is the BA-8 working well? And so I think through that partnership, we could probably get almost every recommendation here. So that's where I land, is that working relationship with DoD and Congress. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
So I will kind of echo both of those thoughts. Having sat through a number of rollout briefings to your congressional staffers, you look at all of the appropriations kind of together. You see how the procurement ties to the RDT&E, or your RDT&E efforts lead to the modifications, and then you see the O&M sustainment for some of those things, or the CLS things that are happening with that. So I think by structuring things differently, which will set things up appropriately, the foster innovation and adaptability, all the things that we can do for the people who are executing things in the year of execution, specifically things like trying to create the 5% carryover not for the O&M and the MILPERS accounts. The department is consistently dinged for how much money cancels at the end of the fiscal year, and it's over $8 billion a year, specifically in O&M funds. So if you think about all the churn and all of the process and the work that we have done to justify all of this money and the requirements and what it's going to do, there are things that just fall out by nature. The budget goes over and it is not going to come back intact. And it's not, whatever gets enacted is not going to be executed the same way either. So if you can give people the ability to change things around and to move money a little bit differently, or to carry it over for a second year, maybe when that big FSRM, Facility Sustainment Restoration and Modernization project, falls out, maybe there's an opportunity to find another project and to get a better bid on something. Or maybe things like those utility bills that are estimates and then come in lower, or maybe come in higher, you can actually appropriately fund without having to try and figure out what to do after that year has already ended. And then the second one for me is also the execution year, being able to, the below threshold reprogrammings, to give you, again, the ability to move money inside programs a little bit more in response to whatever your changing situation is. It's kind of a separate one, but it's the ability to use any color of money for software. So for the full development through to sustainment, I've had to be on reprogramming actions inside OSD Comptroller where you're changing money between appropriations because of the way something has been defined. Well, it's really not the same. It's really not that different, excuse me, right? I think back to the years when you had to use procurement to buy all your IT equipment and to do your IT refresh, and now that's just regular O&M money. And so this is just kind of the continuation of how people work things today, and the continuation of the software, like just evolution, right? Is it, if I'm changing a code because of a bug fix, how is that any different than incorporating something for a new interoperability? It's really not all that different. So I think if you combine all of these things, you'll have the ability to make the changes that are required when needed without an arbitrary seam.
Terry?
Okay, the first sentence of the summary talks about a need for a transformational change. And it's not an incremental change. It's a revolutionary change in the way we do business. And the best way I could describe it to you is I hold in my hand a money clip. This is probably on the endangered species list. And I sort of look at this as PPBE. All right, this is how we started out. It's still functional, it's still good, but it's not very fast. As Laura was mentioning, we have to fill out forms, send them over to get them signed and everything else. At the other end of the spectrum is the cell phone with a credit card attached to the back of it, okay? And I guarantee you, if you talk to the students over here, they're all using PayPal and other systems in order to be able to pay for things. And that, I think, is the way you sort of look at, you have to look at the problem. You've got a tried and true system here, but if you want to get things out there, you're going to have to figure out how to get to here. And so that's the first part of it. The second part of it, I would say, is as I looked at the 28 recommendations, I'd say they break down into two groups. Okay, there's the Congress, which is definitely in their own swim lane. And then you've got the other, which in this case would be DOD. Some of the recommendations are definitely in Congress's lane. And, you would be ill-advised to try and go into Congress's swim lane unless you're wearing Kevlar. On the other side, there are things in here which are totally within the control of the DOD. Everything from J-books to how they put products together to how they communicate with the Hill. So I would take them and put them in those two categories. I think there are certain examples within the congressional lane. For example, below threshold reprogrammings. All right, they've come out and they've already said that they'll increase it from 10 million in the lines to 15 million. That's a start. And is it enough? I would probably say no. However, you don't want to poke the bear, or the bear's going to come after you. And so I think it's a start. And as I said, I welcome any time somebody can figure out a way to increase that speed to the warriors on the tip of the spear.
Well, let me follow up on each of your remarks and based on what you all said. So let me start with you, Terry. 10 to 15 million. It was 10 million when the budget was 300 billion. And so generous of them to raise it from 10 to 15 when the budget's 800 billion. If you really want to do something transformational, you're not going to go to 15 million. And apart from Jamie, really, the three of you talked about Congress. So, Terry, how do you get Congress to be realistic about really raising thresholds?
Well, even though I'm retired, I still get a retirement check from the Navy, so I'm not sure I should take that one on. But anyway, I don't disagree with you that when I went in my first job in the budget world in 1990, it was a $10 million threshold, and today it's 34 years later, if I'm doing the public math correctly, and we've just increased it by from 10 to 15. So, but I would say that the Congress has essentially, in my view, two functions. They have the power of war and the power of the purse, and they guard the power of the purse. It's like virtue. They're guarding it, and they're not going to necessarily let you impinge on their skill sets or their abilities. So how do you go about doing that? I would say it's, in many cases, it's event driven, and it's also personality driven. So you have to look at it from those two perspectives. For example, when we had to handle the IED defeat event, Congress said, don't worry about the money, we'll find you the money. So that was an event where they said, hey, just get it, because people at the tip of the spear were getting hurt, and so, or worse. And so I'd say a lot of times Congress does what I would call just-in-time financing, and it's because they have a various items within their portfolio that they've got to deal with. So I'm not sure there's a pat answer. I'm sure if there were a pat answer, somebody would have done it over the last 200 and almost 50 years that we've been around. And so I would just look at it from that sort of perspective.
Well, I don't disagree with you that Congress is an 18th century institution. And I remember right after 9/11, they threw everything that we at the DOD needed. They gave it to us. But the trouble is, we're talking about institutionalizing things. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So let me turn around to you, Elizabeth. I totally am sympathetic with the idea of a 5% carryover. But two questions. First, the reason this is being pushed is because there's always money on the table in August and September. And then people throw it at whatever they can throw it at so that their budgets aren't cut. So the idea of making it 2 years, in theory, means that it's less likely to happen, although you'll still find money on the table after 2 years and there'll still be some game playing, but it won't be as bad, clearly not. But my question to you is the same one. How are you going to get Congress to agree to that?
Well, so we didn't ask for all O and M to be 2-year money, just 5% of the O and M account and 5% of the mill PERS by appropriation to be available for a second year of obligation.
But
That is-
5% is a rather large number.
It is roughly twice what cancels each year. So it's not an unreasonable sum. So as Jamie and Laura have both mentioned, a lot of this is a dialogue and a recurring discourse with Congress. I think if there's one thing I could also impart, it is not just one conversation and done. This is really a series of long-term conversations in the same topic, just a new something this time. I think too many people sometimes look at this as, oh, I got this and I'm done. And the conversation, like Laura talked about, engaging on something and talking about when things are going well. I've also been fortunate enough to be able to take what was a Marine Corps asset during markup and turn it into 3 different kinds of money in the final enacted bill. There are ways to do that and to have those conversations if you can create a relationship of trust and you can talk about things. It doesn't have to be sharing every single thing that's happening at the point when it's happening, but saying, hey, we're having trouble with this. You may see us come talk to you about that again later this year. And I think there are lots of examples when you look at the appropriations bill and the final tables. The appropriators moved around all kinds of money that the Air Force asked to have enacted properly. I've done that with other organizations as well, where you say, we've got this in the wrong buckets, or when the database locked, it was in this place and it really needs to be here, or we asked for something as O&M that really should have been RDT&E. And if you can make that case with your PSMs and the staffers, they're typically willing to listen and to help you get that correct. Because what that means later on is that you don't have to come back and say, oh, I need to reprogram it. Because one of their questions is, okay, so we've gone through all of these markups, we've had all of these rollouts and all of these conversations. You really couldn't have let us know that that was a problem and we could have tried to help you enact it properly.
So Larry, you talked about developing a relationship, and clearly that's what Elizabeth was just talking about. I remember I had a pretty good relationship with people on the Hill. Basically, I could throw money at what they wanted, so they loved me, right? But how do you make it permanent? How do you institutionalize this? Could you give us a little more? I mean, what you started to say was you can create this kind of special group of people, as it were, that have a common vested interest in making this thing work. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think a lot of the people in the audience are going to be going back to the building, and they need some guidance as to how to get Congress to get unstuck. And so much of it, as you rightly said, isn't members, it's staff. So maybe you could give us a few more hints.
Sure. So through the last couple of years of engagement and even before that in my previous assignments, I engaged a lot with professional staff members. And one of the reasons, if you didn't know, the BTR thresholds for O&M used to be $20 million. And after the border wall, and then also the withholding of the Ukraine funding, a lot of trust was broken. And this is based on conversations I had with PSMs and even the ones who wrote the language that took away the threshold down to $10 million. And so it's about rebuilding the trust and also that transparency of data to get whether it's the thresholds back or this 5% carryover or any of the restructuring of the budget, it's rebuilding the trust in that relationship. Part of it is in-person engagement. So in our interim report, we actually called the recommendation a mid-year update. And as we were doing feedback sessions on the Hill, talking with the HAS, the SAS, the HACD, and the SACD, they said, well, what does mid-year mean to you? And it meant different things to them than it did to us, right? We were thinking of mid-year of our execution. And particularly on the House side, they were irritated because they do markup before mid-year. And they're like, you're going to make our markup superfluous. You're going to give all this information to the Senate side. And so there's a little bit of a tension between the House and the Senate, in case you didn't know. And so we through that engagement, we said, okay, we need to shift our recommendation a little bit based on that feedback. And we went back into the department and talked about working on when you share information and how is it helpful. You should even know that many times when the department delays delivery of the budget, it also delays delivery of the justification books, to the point at which sometimes your Hack D markup, they do it without seeing your justification materials. They're doing it based on really old information. So so sharing information in a timely manner, and I think the only way for it to be timely and accurate at that time is in a more digital format. Now, it's not going to be easy for DoD to develop that enclave to push the budget database information over, to push justification books, but we have to move that way. Otherwise, I think we're going to be stuck where we're at today. Thank you.
Thanks. Jamie, so you talked about capability areas. Can you explain what is the difference between that and mission budgeting, which was an idea that was kicked around maybe 20 odd years ago and sure sounds the same and got nowhere? What's different this time?
Yeah, so I think the key things are, we're talking about the fundamental chart of accounts of the department. A lot of the mission budgeting and portfolio budget conversations that have occurred over the last few decades have been as additional layers, like, or another cross cut, if you will, on top of the existing structure. And those do two fundamentally different things, right? When you chop things up into another dimension of cuts, you actually end up tying people's hands a bit more. Now, some of those proposals that have been out there, and there have been a lot of them over the years, had expedited authorities for moving things within those mission buckets or otherwise, but fundamentally, most of them were layering another set of categories on the budget. We have a budget structure right now, which includes all sorts of legacy categories that still exist, right? The major force programs are essentially used for nothing other than the space and SOCOM ones now, which are the outliers that were created late. The original ones are essentially irrelevant to the management of the department today, but they still exist in the structure. These legacies accrue over time. A point that I think is worth keeping in mind, and this was something we talked, I think, fairly openly among the commission and staff about, and that came up in our interviews a lot. When you recruit people to sit on a commission or to staff a commission who have worked in a system, I mean, this is going to sound slightly self-serving. You're tending to pick the people who have succeeded in the system, right? We're not recruiting. Laura got recruited because she had an enormously successful career as a financial manager across multiple services and DoD and combat commands. That means she solved a lot of hard problems for commanders at every level, many times successfully. Mostly.
Yes.
Yeah. Mostly. The department is a more than $800 billion enterprise with more than 3 million people operating in it. Scale is a challenge, and not everybody is as successful as Laura. Not everybody is as successful as Dove. I think we have to think about the department and its processes as sort of a series of funnels. Like, how many of you in the audience here were program managers at some point? It's about half. How many of you found at some point in managing a program, you had money in the wrong place? Essentially 100% of the program managers. How many of you, when you found you had money in the wrong place, chose not to raise the issue because there was too much risk involved with raising the misalignment? About a quarter of the program managers. So you thought that your chances of successfully getting through the funnel of all of the misalignment issues across the whole department in a better outcome for your program than you went in were not good enough to do it. And that may or may not have been a rational decision. You might have been smart, might have been dumb, but people make those decisions all the time. And it's because the process has to deal with everything, right? And so, yes, it is perfectly possible to go up and talk to a congressional staffer and get money realigned to the right place based on a trust relationship. Does that happen for every program? No. Could the process manage it for every program? Probably not. There's not that many staffers on those committees to take those briefings. So one of the things we're trying to think about here is if we're doing strategic competition to deter China, we've got to be able to be agile at scale, not just by exception when somebody has a really compelling briefing. And we've got to do it in a system where the Congress has the constitutional power of the purse, right? The Constitution says no funds can proceed from the Treasury except in accordance with appropriations enacted into law. I didn't get that quite right, but that's pretty close. So that's what we swore to uphold. So we got to figure out how to work with that Constitution and make it work for the 21st century world we operate in.
That's a terrific answer. And
It wasn't the question you asked, but it was a good
that's
answer.
okay. It was a great answer. Sometimes answering it differently is better than answering the actual question. And this was one of those times. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about why I failed when I added the execution part of the program. And the reason was I wanted to have 3 execution reviews a year. If you're in business and you're burning money, you're reviewing those burns on a daily basis and you move money around. That's not how it works in the department. We have one mid-year review and then we have the budget. And for all the reasons you've heard and read about, that ain't working. So listening to you and recognizing that not every program manager is going to be able to do what you laid out, and even the new system won't do it for every program manager, I would say you have solved the execution review problem to a great extent. And then if you could have a couple more reviews, that'll do the job too. It's now
Can
1:20.
I jump in there real quick on that point?
Sure,
Just
just
say-
don't sing it. That's all.
One of the recommendations that we put a lot of emphasis on was move to continuous planning and analysis. And this is tied in with the systems issues. This is tied in with the others. Again, rather than a single big review of high stakes, how do you have consistent tracking across metrics? Not to drive a single giant omnibus reprogramming request, but rather to drive good management behavior at every level. This ties in also to the recommendation on the, what do we call them? The spend out rates, the obligation.
Expenditure.
Yeah, expenditure threshold. So like those are top down and decades old. If you're building a spend plan for a capital investment in a business, you build a spend plan for the specific capital investment, and then you're held to the plan you built when you pitched the investment. You're not held to some abstract sense of what R&D should spend at. We built that in a process where spreadsheets were literally sheets of paper with people using calculators or hand addition on them. We don't need to do things that way in an environment where we have software handling these things.
And that becomes the execution review, because you're now reviewing on a continuous basis. And you're now running the Pentagon in a business-like fashion. I mean, it would make the CFO a lot happier, I could tell you that. We have about 20 minutes left, as I understand it. Is that correct? 30 minutes, good. So I could do one of two things. I could ask another question, or I could request questions, and then if nobody raises their hand, I'll ask another question. So does anybody in the audience, the live audience, or who's listening in have anything to ask any or all of the panelists?
So what we'll do is we'll have the microphones going around, and if you could just raise your hand and then someone will come to you. And I'll just start it off by throwing out a softball, if I can. And so
I love softball.
the first one is replace PPBE with a defense resourcing system. So it's focused on kind of the main products of PPBE, the defense planning guidance, the POM, and the BES. Are those products going away? Or are you recommending they go away? And if not, isn't it just a name change?
That is a very soft softball. So who wants to swing at it?
We have a slide for that. We'll find it.
It's slide 12, if you could pull that up, please.
Are we going to see slide 12 up here?
Do you want me to, okay, so
There it is.
in a way, those artifacts go away. We've streamlined it. So you still have the National Defense Strategy. But once we go from the defense strategy, this continuous planning and analysis that kicks off what was normally sort of the POM-ish process is starting with threat-based briefings and tabletop exercises, and the culmination of all these meetings and DMAGs involving the joint community. We come up with the defense resourcing guidance that combines what was the defense planning guidance and fiscal guidance. So it's not just overall guidance, it's resource informed, talking about force structure, has more teeth to it, tells you where you can invest, but also areas to take risk, right? So it's not very helpful when the DPG tells you do more in AI or do more in cyber, but then you're not told where you can divest. So this is a much heftier document. This is guidance from OSD down to the services and components. And then the service and components will go off and build their resource allocation submission. So this is a combination of a POM and BESS. And so instead of doing POM and BESS, you're doing one submission to OSD. CAPE and Comptroller will still do their great work, but they're going to be working in more collaborative fashion. So I'm sure many of you deal with CAPE, you deal with Comptroller. Sometimes you get a program decision memorandum or a PBD. Sometimes they're in conflict on your same program. I've actually had the experience where they drove my program budget line item into the negative. You can't have a negative line item, just so you know. You can have a zero. And so also streamlining that down to a resource allocation decision. So again, one document, streamlining the process. And I will tell you, coming from a program office, it's reducing a lot of workload in the field, not just in the Pentagon. This really helps across the entire ecosystem. And then we move to execution. And so largely those changes are in that innovation section where we talk about BTRs and budget line items. But again, as Jamie mentioned, continuous analysis supported by better business systems and common analytics so that decision makers up and down the chain have access to relevant, accurate data to make decisions at speed. Anything else? Did I miss any? Okay.
Anybody else? Oh, hands are starting to come up.
So, yeah. Then
You know what would be nice? Could you please identify yourself and then tell us all whom you're asking
Yes, and your budget line item. So that
My budget line number,
and what program? and-
category 12. So Ray Jones, I'm the Naples Graduate School Chairman of the Department of Defense Management. And so I was a program manager 3 times, 2 ACAT 1 programs. One of the things it's like a general comment for everybody, because it's a broad question. As I go through the recommendations, most of these are focused on process and outputs, if you will. But I can only find one here. It says, strengthen governance of DoD business systems, the governance question. So as I look at this and I look at how does this become enduring so it doesn't become another 40 years later, why aren't we changing? What thoughts, what deliberations were going on with regards to how you put leadership and governance into ensuring that the processes are actually working or they're efficient? Who's in charge? Because if you create a common analytics platform, which we need, also common data across systems, who's responsible? Right now, it seems like the system is on autopilot, but where's the leadership function? Did you discuss that at all in terms of, let's start with the leader and then figure out how these systems work together?
Who wants to take that?
Okay, thanks, Jamie. There was a lot of conversation about who had which kind of functions and then who to give the rows to in the direction and the recommendations from the commission. And so when you go into the 300+ pages here, we are very specific about, we think this is the CDAO, we think this is Comptroller, we think this is CAPE and Comptroller working together, we think this is ANS and R&E, we think this is who owns it, and how direction about here's what we think you should do. You need to have cross-functional teams. You need to make sure that you are getting the input from all of the stakeholders so that what you're creating and pushing forward still gives everybody the voice. All the things that in the restructuring of the defense resourcing system, all those stakeholders still get a voice in the process. That's just maybe structured a little bit differently at different points in time. But we were very, very active in the discussions about how to ensure that the right folks were part of the solution as well.
And regarding the business systems governance, I know that doesn't sound exciting, but I mean, we're in a situation where we have a lot of stovepipe systems that aren't interoperable, don't communicate with each other. And a lot of that is because there's not what I call an adult in the room, helping make sure that we have a rationalized system of systems, right? One system for all of DoD is unreasonable. The mission sets are different, how we operate is different. But in our recommendation on governance, we actually talk about putting someone in DoD CIO responsible, like an SES position under the CIO that will work through the cross-functional team, right? Because it involves CDAO, it involves comptroller and acquisition. Again, so to try to stop having people develop their one-of solutions. I will say there's a lot of good news as we met regularly in DoD, especially looking at business systems and financial systems. The services are doing a great job, Army, Navy, Air Force, of strengthening their internal governance and trying to stop that one-of stovepipe. I don't recall which service it was, even gave us an example of the JAG Corps needed like a case management system. The IG needed one too, and they were starting to go their own ways. And they said, wait a minute, you guys, it's basically the same capability. And instead of, inefficient purchase, they bought one system that they all could use and work in together. So I think DoD is moving in that direction. We're trying to give additional encouragement because it's very difficult for all of DoD to work interoperable.
And I'll just be very brief here and say a certain level of humility is also required here, which is hard for some of us commissioners. But we had a little joke as we got to the end. One of the staff members had a child just as we were wrapping up the commission. And we have been working with Congress to have this child appointed to the Defense Resourcing System Reform Commission, which will presumably be created in about 20 to 30 years. So
That's funny because one of our staffers on my commission just had a child, so there's something going on there. But one thing that I think came out of what you said, Laura, is really important, and people shouldn't lose sight of it. One of my other mess ups as comptroller is I tried to centralize everybody's financial management system. What a disaster. The department's just too big for that. And I remember Gordon England, when he was Secretary of the Navy at the time, coming to me and saying, what you really want to do is let each department, service department, have its own system, and then have some system of middleware that allows them to crosswalk. So I think what you were talking about, Lara, is a lot more sensible. You got to realize just this is a huge elephant. It's a behemoth. And if you try to do everything centrally, you're going to fall on your face. So I commend the commission for recognizing that you can only do what's in the art of the possible. And again, when folks go back into the building and work these problems, bear that in mind, particularly if you're going to go to OSD, because the temptation is, with all due respect, Jamie, OSD wants to manage the whole thing. It just doesn't work. And so a recognition that it's much better to be a holding company with different corporations rather than one central company with, essentially subsidiaries, is probably the way to go. And ever since McNamara, of course, the idea was, well, we got to centralize OSD. There's a very important role for OSD, but it isn't that one. Anyway.
Gary Thomason with Space Systems Academic Group here at Naval Postgraduate School. I'm on the front line with a lot of our classes. We reviewed your proposals in the class, and the question that many of the students, some of whom are here today, asked that I could not answer, and I'd love to hear your response. What do you think the probability of implementation for all of these 28 recommendations would be? You mentioned DepSecDef Hicks actually going forth and directing some of it, but perhaps you could address that and maybe some specific examples would be appreciated. Thank you.
Let me just break that into two parts so that you can take it either way. One is implementation by DOD, the other is implementation by Congress, and any of you can address either one of those.
I think the answer is it's a spectrum across the recommendations, right? There's 28. There are very differing levels of challenge, degree of difficulty. We need to land quite a few of them if we're going to win the gold medal in the Olympics that really matter here. So we don't have to succeed on all of them, but we do need to succeed on some of the big ones. The most transformational ones are going to be the hardest ones to implement and are going to take the longest. I talked at some length earlier about the budget structure transformation. You know, the commission deliberately laid that out as a 4-year or so process, because you got to get consensus about what you need to, what matters and what needs to be accounted for before you make the proposals about how to move all of the activities into the new system. So that's a long journey. That's a very long time in political terms. So it would require significant sustained attention. I'm hopeful, but you know, we knew we couldn't bank on that coming to fruition. And we also knew things had to happen in the nearer term, right? There are senior leaders in the intelligence and military community who are convinced we may be at a crisis of deterrence in the next 3 to 4 years. So doesn't help us if we solve the problem after the war. Now, I'm not necessarily subscribing to the inevitability of any one particular date, and nor should we abandon long-term proposals just because we're concerned about a near-term threat. But that's why you see things like, hey, we got to increase the reprogramming thresholds back to something akin to the purchasing power they lost through 2 decades of inflation, and the step down we took due to the crisis of confidence that Laura talked about earlier. And we've already seen some progress on that. So, you know, I think you've got to go one by one through these. I think you've got, clearly the department is on a path toward common data systems built on translators and repositories, as Dove laid out. The department is on a path to much more continuous analysis. The analysis working group that DepSecDef Hicks has set up is a federated system with the services doing a lot of the work, but it feeding into a common framework. So we are seeing useful progress in just the 2 years the commission has been in existence. Some of the things that we would have written down are now happening. And so we, in some cases, we still wrote them down so we could take credit for the good idea, even if the department was already doing it. But there's progress being made. The trust piece and the Congress in their constitutional role piece is the critical variable for all of the fundamental changes. Even if they're within the department's authority, the Congress can still say no proactively if they choose to. And so that is the one that I think needs leadership attention on a consistent basis for the next, certainly the next presidential administration, and I think even beyond. So that is the thing that has to be placed at the fore, and there will be important considerations that will drive the leadership of the department away from that in execution, right? There are real pressures to move fast and to not consult and to not be as transparent as you could be, because you run the risk of interference. And the crisis of the moment will feel more important than regaining that trust. But our view, I think, across the commission is the department needs to be prepared to make some sacrifices in its short-term tactical independence and ability to move in order to rebuild that confidence for strategic benefit.
Anyone else want to jump in?
So I would offer in the FY24 bill, from the HAC-D markup, came direction for the Space Force to work with HAC-D on what that portfolio look might be for Space Force. And it was directed to be an iterative series of conversations and to continue engaging on what that would look like. Also in the 24 markup from the SAC-D and in the final appropriations bill, there are pages of commentary about how the appropriations committees have worked with the Army to consolidate 93 RDT&E PEs over several years. And there's also direction to the Army to consolidate their budget line items inside the other procurement Army account. So they are open to conversation as well. And I think they're really just looking for that collaboration and the what makes sense. You know, you can't come back with everything in one PE. So how can you find what makes sense?
I'd speak to it from an operator perspective or from the services. And I think essentially the services will adhere to what comes down from from the offices up at OSD. I can't think of an instance, I'm sure there have been, but I can't think of an instance where the services have gone on the offensive and said, no, we're not going to do that. So I think from that perspective, I think they will go forward and they will, as Secretary Hicks elaborates on the proposals, they will go forward and execute them to the best of their abilities. As with respect to the others, I would go back to the point that Laura made earlier about when dealing with the Hill. If you don't have a relationship with the folks over there or you don't have their trust, then I think you're going to have a harder road to hoe than if you have developed a relationship over time. That's particularly true with the professional staffs. The professional staffs are there for a long period of time. The personal staffs, it's almost a revolving door policy with the personal staffs, but the professional staffers have, many of them are prior DOD folks who have now gone over there and in order to work. So I think that would be the sort of the way the operators in the building will look at it as they go forward.
So I'll just add, DepSec Hicks did direct implementation for the department develop implementation plans for 13 recommendations that came from our interim report. And we know that several of them have already, the services are already leaning forward and kicking off, as well as with OSD on like budget line item consolidation or revamping the 7,000-page DoD financial management regulation, which is just unforgiving in the year of execution. We find that very encouraging. It was very interesting in our regular meetings with DoD leadership across the services, how excited many of them were about the budget restructure or consolidating line items. And so in some cases, the services were really trying to get DoD, OSD leadership excited about some of these changes, right? Because it's just some of these restructure changes are hard. But I'm really encouraged by members of Congress. We've had several closed briefings and then one open hearing with the SASC, and how many members are engaged and wanting to make change. They want to legislate some changes that really DoD could just move out on right now. It doesn't need legislation, but they have engaged with the commission on us to help them draft some of those legislative changes. So I'm hopeful that you're going to see some differences in the 25 authorization, hopefully appropriation bill as well. It's helpful that the SASC chair, Senator Reed, is also an appropriator, so he's trying to engage. Like that, they're the toughest customer. Make no mistake, the appropriators are the toughest customer. But we also had a great engagement with the HACG chair, Ken Calvert, and he is also very much ready for us to move faster, but also to move like the private sector from a business perspective. So again, there's going to have to be that give and take between the relationship in DoD and Congress. But I think everyone across the whole ecosystem is ready for this transformational change to happen.
Next question. Sir.
Hey, good afternoon. Jason Thomas, Director of Digital Transformation for NOC AD. We're at a point in our history where a lot of Congress has not served in the military previously. So we talked about the points of the alignment between the department and Congress and understanding maybe some capabilities, some needs, some timelines and constraints that we're all dealing with. So I guess what role do you think some of that plays in some of the challenges currently within PPBE, and what role do you think some of the digital transformation work in alignment with data and understanding of what's being shown and understanding the context of what's being shown with the data and the interdependencies between investments, procurement, outcomes?
Somebody want to take that?
I guess I'll do a top level response, and Terry, maybe you've got now that you're an academic and are paid to think. Terry was a tough partner when he was the N8 and I was trying to get money for the Air Force. look, we are living in an increasingly fragmented world. We all consume information from our own curated input sources. You know, I see what's happening in a policy area where I don't specialize, like infrastructure maintenance and the civilian side. And, you know, I shake my head and I don't understand all of the reasons why things are hard there that I understand all too well about the Department of Defense. So the point you bring up that we no longer live in a draft military world where a large share of the population has at least a basic understanding of what it means to serve in uniform and to wear the nation's cloth and to carry weapons on behalf of the government. That isn't the world we live in anymore. And there's some good and positive reasons for that. We haven't had a world war. But we have to figure out how to operate in that environment. And we have to figure out how to do that, like, for the success of our democracy writ large. Defense is one of many parts of this world where we understand our thing. We know why our thing is important. And we struggle with the fact that nobody else thinks it's as cool or as important as we do. So this is like a much bigger problem about societal cohesion and, you know, rallying around big problems and solving them. So can we do better in articulating what the department does, winning the trust of Congress? Absolutely. Should it be built on a foundation that we expect them to be, you know, near experts in the things we do? No, that's not going to work. It's not the reality we live in. So again, one of the ideas behind why you want to express a budget in mission-oriented terms or capability areas is like, that's a hell of a lot easier to wrap your head around. It's a lot easier to communicate. And that might make the job of building consensus around what we're trying to do just a little bit easier.
Yeah, I found with some exceptions, there are always exceptions to the rule, but I found I spent a fair amount of time over on the Hill, one-on-one with members. I also spend time over there testifying. And I found in almost all of those sessions, especially the one-on-ones, that they were interested and supportive of what we were trying to accomplish. Now, one thing you have to remember is when you go over to the Hill and you're testifying and there are cameras in the room, it's not about you. It's about whoever the individual happens to be. And they are working toward that, I'd say, the 15-second soundbite that you're going to see on the national news. In fact, I had a personal experience where I actually was over there with someone who was very pro-military. And yet, if you listen to the 15-second soundbite that night, you would have thought that, you know, I was the second coming of the devil. And so you have to understand the context in which you're dealing when you go over to the Hill and who you're dealing with. You also have to understand all politics are local. And you have to look at that particular, it could be the district, it could be the state, depending upon whether you're dealing with the House or the Senate. But a lot of it is driven by what their constituents are driving for them. So they may be on your side, but they may have a very vocal constituency that is taking a position, and they are trying to figure out, okay, how do I straddle the issue or work my way through it? So.
Well, let me give you an anecdote and then an observation. One time I was testifying in front of the Foreign Relations Committee, which is an unusual experience for a DOD guy. And it was during the Iraq War, and they were loaded for bear. And this one senator is just giving me hell. It was so bad that the State Department undersecretary sitting next to me said, "Do you want me to take the next question?" And I said, "Nah, you know, it's so bad already." So I go up to this guy after the hearing, and I know him. I've known him for years. And I said, "Why the heck did you do that?" And he said, "What do you mean? It was on TV." So what Terry said is absolutely accurate. There's a flip side, of course, where you have constituencies that are pro-defense because they've got bases there, they've got industry there. And most of those folks will wind up on armed services or defense appropriations. So the real issue is, can you get them and with them get others to support defense? And it really is a joint effort. It's the kind of thing Lara was talking about. It's doable. It does happen. I mean, let's face it, look at the budget supplemental that just came through. And whether you're a D or an R, you got to give credit to Johnson for what he did, but you also got to give credit to Hakeem for supporting Johnson. Because fundamentally, defense and national security generally is a bipartisan issue. And the challenge, I think, for all of us who care about national defense is to ensure that it remains bipartisan. And the only way you can do that is what Lara was talking about. You've got to work with these people. You've got to work with staff. You've got to make the extra effort, the extra breakfast, the extra briefing. If you don't do that, and I've known very senior officials who didn't, it blows up in your face. Simple as that. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if
so
I
you
could
have
ju-
8 minutes. There's 2 questions queued up, so whether you can.
Let's do them both.
Hey, I would just like to add as an aside to what Dev was just saying. I was over on the Hill one day and I was having a particularly challenging day. And my other service buddy who was sitting next to me said, I think I'm going to move my chair so I don't become collateral damage. And so there are more days like that than you'd like to remember.
Cynthia Cook, Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for your work. The one thing about finishing a big project like this is we can look forward to the next one. And I think that is the Section 811, modernizing the Department of Defense requirements process. So you've touched on some requirements issues in your talks today. My question for you, since you just completed this amazing effort, thinking back over the last 2 years, do you have any thoughts, insights, advice for the Section 811 effort? Are there any analytic products that you'd recommend? Any process approaches that you recommend? Just sort of looking forward, what are your thoughts on that?
Hire Lara.
They can't afford me. I think you have to approach it with an open mind, and, build a team. I think building the team of subject matter experts across that whole ecosystem, right? So it can't be all folks that work the JROC process, but folks that have been impacted by it throughout their career. So I think you need a diverse team with all kinds of skill sets. So that I say would be number one. Obviously, we did a lot of research, pulling from history, the whole history of PPBS through all current execution. And then we hired some great teammates some are in the room, from RAND, from George Mason. I see Jerry over there, from Stevens Institute. I think Dr. Phil Anton somewhere in the room. So finding those SMEs across the ecosystem where you're not going to necessarily have that organic talent resident. And then I cannot stress enough, it was exhausting for 2 years of engagements. We had well over 400 engagements with more than 1,100 individuals, from current and former DoD practitioners, the private sector, through the industrial base, current and former staffers and members, that getting that feedback on their experiences, as well as their ideas for improvements. And then we distilled that through, I don't even know how many commission meetings. We had 40 or 50, getting all 14 commissioners together and letting them wrestle with it, to come up with the 28 recommendations we came up with. I think it's painful, but I don't think there's a simple, easy button for that analysis. I don't know, Liz, do you have anything?
Yeah, I wish there was an easy button to give you. I think the other thing that we really spent a lot of time with commissioners talking about was how many recommendations to have and what could be actionable. So we got a lot of suggestions like, oh, it should all be know your money. We shouldn't have to talk to anybody about anything. Okay, so we all know that's not going to go anywhere. But we did spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the root cause was and like how to try and work around that and make that process or the decision making or whatever it was better, so that that's what became our set of recommendations.
Okay, Jamie. you
Yeah,
want to-
I actually will weigh in
Sure.
with one other point there, which is putting the institutional tension in the commission is really important. I talked up front about having Bob Hale and Ellen Lord as chair and co-chair, right? Two very different sets of background. And that forced us away from the comfortable and easy recommendations and the unadoptable recommendations. So just JSIDS and that process is different in that it is much less statutory and more internal to the department. So there's going to be more freedom of action, but the requirements process is essentially meaningless in its own, just like the budget process is meaningless in its own and the acquisition process is meaningless in its own. The action is at the interfaces. And so having those interfaces reflected in the commission and having the tension between here's why we do it this way and here's why we have to change is, I think, super important.
I'll just add, from a lot of our engagements with program managers and PEOs, we did get a lot of feedback on how painful the way that requirement was defined could make their job, right? And make it very difficult for them to flex to a new capability or changing threat. So I think the JSIDS folks working on that reform need to really talk to the acquisition community.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, but if people don't complain about an overrun, just think Pentagon. Well, there was one other
So,
question.
so we do have one question. Make it quick.
Sir,
Yes, Alex Cherry, I'm a student here, Supply Corps Officer. I was very excited about the panel and the initiative to look into PPBE, and I think that's very important. I really appreciated the brief yesterday that showed that PPBE was not supposed to be, or nor does it have to be, the best systems, because other people, other organizations, other countries are doing something different. So with that said, with 28 recommendation, I feel like we might miss the boat on doing something or pushing the decision makers to do something that is truly game changing to help the warfighters on the ground. Obviously, reading through those recommendations, it shows a walk, crawl, run type of approach. So I think that's what you're looking at as well. But at the same time, I'm wondering if you're really pushing the people where it matters to really do something big, to delegate more and make the warfighters' job easier.
somebody want to take that?
I guess since we're closing here, I'll just say, we're a commission and we're going away. So the job actually falls to the leadership of the Department of Defense and the leadership of the Congress to drive this forward. I mean, we're also individual human beings who will presumably be kicking around and happy to continue helping, but our statutory authority goes away. This is a opportunity for the department to decide, do they like these recommendations? If so, are they going to do the hard work of starting the conversation about how to implement them? And same on the congressional side. So it's a starting point for the hard work of politics and governance.
Let me just say this, that there's a study out that I think your commission put out that looked at what other countries do. It's actually very, very interesting, and I would recommend it to you. Does anybody else in the commission want to have a final word before we close?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I was not on the commission, but there is a line in the conclusion that says, time is short, the need is increasingly urgent. And I take that to heart because no truer words were spoken with respect to this commission.
Well, all I can say is, I think this is this report and the commission's work is a phenomenal start. I mean, what they've done is essentially look at everything that's happened in the last 60 years and said, you can't go on this way. That in and of itself is a crucial message. And then they lay out how they want to fix it. And if the department and the Congress want to fix it differently, okay, fine. But there's fixing that needs to be done. And I think anybody who has any influence in the building, whoever's going there or teaching people who will be going there, pass this message along, because we are not a top-down Xi Jinping type China or Vladimir Putin type Russia who can just snap their fingers and everybody says, how high do you want me to jump? We have to have a consensus. And the only way we get consensus on keeping this country where it's been for the last year since World War II, that is to say, the leading country in the world, is if we can forge that consensus. And so I hope you'll take what these wonderful panelists took to heart, that you'll take it to heart. They already took it to heart, and pass the message along. Thanks.
So obviously, we're gonna close inform the 3 rooms again, and stick with us. We have 2 more panel sessions, and I'd really I know the researchers that present their work in these last 2 panel sessions will really want your questions and your feedback. They've done a lot of work to prepare their presentations and research. So 15 minutes, and the next panel sessions will start.